This session, in this session, we are going to study how we can use the G-Power software to estimate appropriate sample size based on the type of statistical technique that we are using for analyzing the data to providing answers to the research objectives or the hypothesis that we want to test. So the G-Power software is available online. You can download it and install it on your system. It is free, and I'll commend you to download and install to support you when you want to use any particular kind of statistical technique for analyzing your data, and that one can influence the choice of the sample size that you must use in such instance. So let's look at a particular situation. In this case, if we want to select, if you want to test for regression, for instance, then we have to look at the test family that the regression belongs to, and it belongs to the F test family. So we have to now go and select the appropriate statistical text that can support that we want to do. And so we want to use linear regression with a fixed model R square deviation from 0. So that becomes the appropriate statistical test or the technique. Okay, the technique talks about the tools that are embedded in the software that can be used for testing a particular objective or hypothesis. So if you want to look at if influence or effect or the impact of social media advertising on marketing performance, for instance, then you can use the linear multiple regression. That is when we see that we conceptualize the social media as second order construct and or having multiple indicators, then we can use it to determine the appropriate sample size for such a study. Now, we have to look at the input parameters that will inform the determination of the sample size. And one issue that we have to be careful with is that we make inferences about some of the parameters in previous studies before we can determine the appropriate parameters to select to help you in determining your sample size. So if the study you think that the effect size is small based on previous studies, you can select the small effect size, which is measured by the F square. If you think that for your study, previous studies report on larger effect size based on the predictive uh, margin of the predictors in such a model, then you have to select the large. So in this instance, assuming that the study that we want to conduct, previous studies have used large, have reported large effect size, then we will have to select large effect size. That becomes the 0.35. So that is what we are using here. The margin of error, as we saw it, is always at 0, is in most instances at 0.05, and the power, which is measured by the level of confidence intervals, is the 95% or 0.9. So the question is, how many predictors must we include in such a study to be able to estimate the appropriate sample size for such a study? Assuming that social media advertising has some sub-construct and we are able to test the validity, test the reliability, and has transformed them into composite variable, then we can use those composite variable as the number of predictors. So assuming that the assist, we put it there, and then we just click on calculate. As soon as we calculate, it will give us the actual sample size that we can generate, as we can see here. So if the effect size is estimated as large and we have 0.05 as a probability of error or sampling error. And then we also have 95% confidence interval, or what we call power. Then we expect that the um, and we have we have 6 predictors. Then the actual sample size we can use in such a study becomes the 67. This 67 is a minimum sample size. But the most important element that we have to consider here to be able to justify whether the 67 is enough for that kind of study is the actual power that we are able to generate. Actual power, we need a minimum of 0.8 for us to conclude that yes, the 67 sample size is adequate to warrant the generalization of the findings on the total population. So this is how we can use the G power to analyze and determine the appropriate sample size. We can also try our hands on other tests and see. So let's look at some t-tests that we have to conduct. If you want to look at t-test element, we have to look at the statistical test that we can use. Maybe we want to use the man-Whitney test as non-parametric alternative, and then we can select the tail. Either we are using one tilt or two tilt. If the hypothesis is directional, we have to use one tilt. If it's non-directional, we use two tilt. So that is how it informs that. And we assume that the data is normally distributed. So let's look at the parameter of the sample size if we want to maintain that, and then allocation ratio, we make it 1. We can change the allocation ratio and make it say maybe 0.5. So we can now calculate and see if that is the situation. Then it means that the actual power obtained is 0.9, and then the minimum sample size for such a study is 206, and then the sample size for group 1, maybe for small enterprises, we need at least 137, and for group 2 we will need about 69 as the minimum sample size. So this is how useful the use of the G power can support the determination of appropriate sample size for studies. You can explore the various test families depending on the type of statistical test or the technique that you want to employ. You just have to input in the appropriate parameters to support your study, and you are good to go. Thank you.